The candles in the Royal Opera House burned bright, but Eleanor Hartley felt only cold when the Duke of Ashbourne bowed before her and asked for her hand in the next dance. Every eye in the gallery turned toward them. Fans stopped moving. A hush spread across the crowd like spilled wine across silk. "I must decline, Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice steady even as her heart pounded against her ribs. A murmur rippled through the crowd. No woman refused the Duke of Ashbourne. Not in London, not in any drawing room from Mayfair to Bath. He was the most sought-after man in England, with a fortune that could buy half the county, and a face that made grown women forget their own names. Eleanor had heard the stories long before she ever saw him in person. They said he had inherited his title at 23, when his father died suddenly, and that he had spent the years since building his estates into the most profitable in the north. They said he never danced more than once with any lady, never wrote letters he did not intend to keep, and never gave his attention to anyone without a reason. Tonight, for reasons she could not fathom, he had chosen her, and she had thrown that attention back in his face before the entire opera house. She could still feel the warmth of the gaslight on her shoulders, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing against her skin, and beneath it all, the strange calm of having done exactly what she intended to do. Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ashbourne, did not move. His dark eyes studied her for a long moment, and something flickered behind them that was not quite anger and not quite surprise. "You decline," he repeated, as if testing the shape of the words in his mouth. "I do," Eleanor said. He inclined his head, the barest movement, and turned away without another word. The orchestra resumed. The crowd exhaled as one, and 100 whispers rose like startled birds. Eleanor did not watch him go. She fixed her eyes on the stage below, where the opera singers had begun their aria, and tried to steady her breathing. Her cousin Charlotte appeared at her elbow within seconds, her face pale with disbelief. "Have you lost your senses?" Charlotte whispered. That was the Duke of Ashbourne. "Do you understand what you have just done?" "I understand perfectly well," Eleanor said. "Half the mothers in this room would trade their own daughters for such an offer, and you refused him as though he were a tradesman asking for the wrong parcel." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She did not explain herself, not even to Charlotte, who had stood beside her through every hardship of the past 2 years. She did not speak of the last time a titled gentleman had smiled at her with practiced charm, only to leave her family's name dragged through scandal, and her father's business ruined by a broken promise. She did not speak of the nights she had lain awake listening to her mother weep in the next room, or the slow, grinding work of rebuilding what little pride remained to the Hartley name. She would not hand her heart, or her family's future, to another man with a title and a smile, no matter how many diamonds glittered at his throat. She remembered the gentleman's name still, though she never spoke it aloud anymore. He had courted her with letters full of promises, had spoken of a future built on trust and quiet devotion, and had vanished the moment her father's shipping business began to falter. Within a season he had married an heiress from Bristol, and within 2, rumors had begun to circulate that the Hartley family could no longer be trusted, that their misfortune was somehow a mark against their character rather than simple bad luck. Eleanor had watched her father's hands shake as he read the letters that ended contract after contract, watched the light go out of her mother's eyes a little more with each passing month. She had promised herself, in the quiet of her own room, that she would never again allow a man's charm to decide her family's fate. Charlotte studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. "I only worry for you," she said. "I do not wish to see you punished for a wound that was never your fault." "I know," Eleanor said, and pressed her cousin's hand gently. "But I would rather bear the gossip of one evening than the grief of another broken promise." "They will talk of nothing else for a month," Charlotte said, glancing nervously toward the box where Lady Margaret Vane sat watching them with open delight, her fan moving slow and deliberate, like a cat watching a mouse it had already caught. Eleanor knew that look. Lady Margaret Vane was the Duke's cousin, and she had never once looked kindly upon anyone who might catch her cousin's eye, and threaten whatever plans she nursed for her own son, Lord Cassian Vane. If there was gossip to be spread, Margaret would spread it before the candles burned to their sockets. "Let them talk," Eleanor said. "Words cannot ruin what is already broken." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of every gaze still lingering on her, felt the way the room had shifted, as though she had committed some unforgivable crime simply by speaking the truth aloud. The aria ended. Applause rose and fell. Eleanor rose from her seat, intending to slip toward the refreshment room where she might catch a moment of quiet, but as she moved through the crowd, she found her path blocked by a broad-shouldered gentleman she did not recognize. "Miss Hartley," he said, bowing with exaggerated grace, I could not help but witness your extraordinary display of courage this evening. I do not believe we have been introduced, sir. Lord Cassian Vane, at your service. His smile did not reach his eyes. Cousin to the Duke you have just humiliated in front of the entire ton. Eleanor's spine straightened. I humiliated no one. I simply declined an invitation to dance. A distinction that will be lost on most of London by morning, I assure you. Cassian's gaze traveled over her with an appraising slowness that made her skin prickle with discomfort. Tell me, Miss Hartley, was it courage that made you refuse him, or something else? A secret understanding, perhaps, with another gentleman? There is no secret understanding, Lord Vane. There is only my own wish to be left undisturbed. How refreshing, he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. Most young ladies in your position would grasp at any thread that might lift them from difficulty. I hear the Hartley fortunes are not what they once were. The words struck like a slap, precise and deliberate. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from fury at his cruelty dressed as polite conversation. You hear a great many things, it seems, Lord Vane. I wonder how much of it is true. Enough of it, he said, and this time his smile held something sharper, something that made her wary. I only hope, for your family's sake, that your pride does not cost you more than you can afford to lose. He bowed again and melted back into the crowd before she could form a reply, leaving her standing alone with her pulse hammering and a cold unease settling into her stomach. She did not see the Duke again that evening, not directly, but once, near the end of the night, as she stood near the tall windows overlooking the torchlit street, she felt a gaze upon her and turned to find him watching her from across the room. He did not approach. He did not smile. He simply looked at her with an expression she could not name, something between curiosity and something far more dangerous, before Lady Margaret appeared at his side and drew his attention away. Eleanor turned back to the window, telling herself the flutter in her chest was nothing more than the lingering unease of Cassian's threats. The carriage ride home was silent. Charlotte kept glancing at her, clearly wishing to speak but unwilling to break the tension that filled the small space. Eleanor stared out at the passing streets, the gas lamps blurring into streaks of gold against the darkness, and allowed herself, finally, to breathe. She had done what she needed to do. She had protected herself, protected her family's fragile dignity, and refused to be swept into another arrangement built on charm and empty promises. And yet, she could not shake the memory of the Duke's eyes finding hers across that crowded room, nor the strange, unsettling certainty that this was not the end of the matter, but only the beginning. When she arrived home, she found her mother waiting in the drawing room, her face drawn with worry, a letter clutched in her trembling hands. Eleanor, her mother said, there is something you must see. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She crossed the room and took the letter, her eyes scanning the elegant, unfamiliar handwriting, and felt the last of her composure crack. It was a notice from their creditors, demanding payment within the month, or the loss of the small townhouse that was all the Hartleys had left. They say your father's last investment failed completely, her mother whispered. The ship never reached its port. Everything we had left was on that vessel. Eleanor lowered herself into the chair beside her mother, the letter trembling slightly in her own hands now. She thought of the servants they had already let go, the rooms they had closed off to save on coal, the quiet way her mother had begun selling small pieces of jewelry that no one was meant to notice were missing. We will find a way, Eleanor said, though she did not know how. We always have. Her mother reached out and took her hand, her fingers cold despite the warmth of the room. Charlotte told me what happened tonight, at the opera. Eleanor's chest tightened. Mother, I did not refuse him out of foolishness. I know why you refused him, her mother said quietly. I only wonder if we can still afford your pride. The words settled over Eleanor like a weight she could not shrug away. She thought of the creditor's letter, of her father's downcast eyes at dinner these past weeks, of the growing silence that had crept into every corner of their home. Somewhere beneath her fear, a colder thought took root. She had just refused the one man in London whose wealth could have solved every problem her family faced with a single word. She wondered, for the first time that night, whether her pride had been a shield or a mistake. Long after her mother had gone to bed, Eleanor sat alone by the dying fire, turning the creditor's letter over in her hands, and found herself thinking, against her own will, of the way the Duke had looked at her from across the crowded room, not with anger, as she had expected, not even with wounded pride. Something else entirely, something she could not name, and something that frightened her far more than his title ever could. 3 days after the opera, a black carriage bearing the Ashbourne crest stopped outside the Hartley townhouse. and Eleanor watched from the window with her heart climbing into her throat. She had expected gossip. She had expected cold stares at church, whispered conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. She had not expected the Duke of Ashbourne himself to appear at her door, uninvited and unannounced, less than a week after she had refused him in front of all of London. "Miss Hartley," the butler announced, his voice tight with surprise. "His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne, requests a moment of your time." Eleanor set down her needlework with hands that were not quite steady. "Tell him I am not receiving visitors today." But before the butler could relay the message, Julian Ashworth stepped past him into the drawing room, his tall frame filling the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, though his tone carried no apology at all. "I did not come to renew my invitation to dance, Miss Hartley. I came on a matter of business." Eleanor rose to her feet, startled despite herself. "Business, Your Grace? I cannot imagine what business you could have with my family." "Your father's shipping venture," Julian said. "The Cormorant. I understand it was lost at sea 3 weeks ago, and that your family holds a significant debt as a result." The color drained from Eleanor's face. "How do you know of this?" "I make it my business to know a great many things," he said simply. "I also happen to hold a share in the same shipping company your father invested with. Their losses this season have been considerable, and I intend to see certain debts settled fairly, rather than see families ruined by circumstances outside their control." Eleanor's pride flared hot and sudden. "If you have come to offer charity, Your Grace, I must decline, just as I declined your invitation at the opera." Something flickered across his face, an almost imperceptible tightening at the corner of his mouth. "This is not charity, Miss Hartley. It is business, conducted between men of honor and the families affected by their failures. I would extend the same courtesy to any family in your position, title or no title. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe." "Believe what you wish," he said, and for the first time, something like genuine irritation crept into his voice. "But do not let your pride cost your family a home they may not be able to reclaim once it is lost." The words landed with uncomfortable precision, echoing her mother's own warning from 3 nights before. Eleanor felt her resolve waver, just slightly, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "And what precisely would this arrangement require of my family?" "Nothing beyond patience," Julian said. "I intend to restructure the debt across a longer term, at a rate your father can manage without losing this house, or what remains of his dignity. I ask nothing in return, Miss Hartley, save that you allow me to conduct this business honestly, without assuming the worst of every gesture I make." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the practiced charm she had learned to distrust, the smooth insincerity that had once cost her family everything. She found none of it. Instead, she found something almost weary beneath his composure, as though the effort of proving his sincerity cost him more than he wished to admit. "Why," she asked finally, "would you trouble yourself with the debts of a family who humiliated you in front of the entire ton?" A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Perhaps I found your refusal more interesting than 100 acceptances." Eleanor did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all. He took her silence as an opening. "I will have my solicitor call upon your father tomorrow morning, if that is agreeable. The arrangement will bear no mention of my name beyond what is legally necessary. No one need know of my involvement at all. Why would you wish to hide your generosity, Your Grace? Most men in your position would want the credit for such a gesture. Most men in my position have not spent their lives being courted for their fortune rather than their character," he said, and there was an edge beneath the words that told her this was not mere philosophy, but something closer to old private pain. "I find I prefer to do good quietly, when I can manage it." Before she could respond, the drawing room door opened, and her father entered, his face pale with confusion at finding a duke standing in his modest parlor. "Your Grace," he stammered, bowing low, "I was not informed of your visit." "Please, forgive the state of the house we were not expecting." "There is nothing to forgive," Julian said, and the warmth in his voice as he addressed her father surprised Eleanor more than anything else that had happened that afternoon. "I came only to discuss a business matter, regarding the Cormorant's losses. Your daughter has been kind enough to hear me out." Eleanor watched, torn between relief and unease, as Julian spoke with her father in calm, measured tones about interest rates and repayment schedules, about extensions and fair terms that seemed almost too generous to be believed. Her father's shoulders, bowed for weeks under the weight of failure, seemed to straighten with every passing minute. "I confess, Your Grace," her father said at one point, his voice thick with emotion he could not quite hide, "I had resigned myself to selling this house before the month was out. My wife has not slept a full night in weeks for worry of it. Then I am glad I came when I did, Julian said, and there was no trace of pity in his voice, only a plain, steady kindness that seemed to ease something in her father's posture. A man should not lose the roof over his family's head for a storm he did not summon. The sea takes ships regardless of how carefully a man plans his fortune. I have seen it happen to better sailors than most. You speak as though you understand the business well. I have interests in 3 shipping companies, and I have buried more than one investment at the bottom of the Atlantic, Julian said, with the faint, dry humor of a man long accustomed to such losses. I do not hold your misfortune against you, sir. I hold only poor character against a man, and nothing in your daughter's conduct, nor in your own, suggests anything but honesty. Eleanor's father glanced toward her then, something like quiet pride softening his tired face, and Eleanor found she had to look away, unsettled by how easily the Duke's words had found their mark. When Julian finally rose to take his leave, he paused at the drawing-room door and turned back to Eleanor. I do not expect gratitude, Miss Hartley, he said quietly, so that only she could hear. I only ask that you judge me by my actions, rather than the actions of men who came before me. He bowed and departed, leaving Eleanor standing in stunned silence at the center of the room. Her father turned to her, his eyes bright with something she had not seen in months. Hope. Eleanor, do you understand what this means? We may keep the house, we may recover. In time, without losing everything your grandfather built. I understand, Eleanor said softly, though her mind was a tangle of confusion she could not begin to untangle. That night, she could not sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every word the Duke had spoken, searching for the hidden motive she was certain must exist beneath his kindness. Men of his station did not simply appear at the doors of struggling families and offer salvation without expecting something in return. She had learned that lesson too painfully to forget it now. And yet, she could not shake the memory of his voice when he spoke of being courted for his fortune rather than his character, the flash of old wound beneath his composed exterior. It had sounded, for just a moment, like a man who understood loneliness far better than his title would suggest. 2 days later, Charlotte arrived at the Hartley townhouse breathless with news, her cheeks flushed from the cold and from excitement in equal measure. You will not believe what is being said at Lady Farrington's this morning, Charlotte announced, barely waiting for the door to close behind her. It seems the Duke of Ashbourne has declined 3 separate invitations to dine this week, all from families with unmarried daughters. Lady Margaret is positively beside herself. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Why would that concern me? Because, Charlotte said, settling onto the settee with the satisfaction of a woman delivering the very best gossip of the season. He has been seen, not once but twice, directing his solicitor toward business concerning a family whose name no one can quite confirm. Lady Margaret suspects it is you. That is absurd, Eleanor said, though her pulse quickened uncomfortably. Is it? You did refuse him at the opera, and now here you are, keeping your family home against every expectation, just weeks after your father's business failed entirely. People are beginning to ask questions, Eleanor. Eleanor rose and moved to the window, watching the gray London sky press low over the rooftops. Let them ask. There is nothing improper in a business arrangement conducted through solicitors and paperwork. Perhaps not, Charlotte said, her voice softening with genuine concern now. But you must be careful. Lady Margaret does not forgive easily, and she has never forgiven anyone who threatens whatever plans she holds for her son. Eleanor thought of Lord Cassian Vane's cold smile at the opera, his carefully worded threats disguised as polite conversation, and felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the weather outside. I have no interest in the Duke's attention, Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain they were true. I only wish for my family's troubles to be resolved and for this entire matter to be forgotten as quickly as possible. Charlotte studied her for a long moment, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Forgotten, yes, of course. Eleanor did not dignify that with a response, though long after Charlotte had gone, she found herself standing at the window still, watching the street below, half hoping and half dreading the sight of a black carriage bearing the Ashbourne crest. It did not come again that week, but the memory of Julian Ashworth's voice, quiet and sincere in her family's modest drawing room, lingered far longer than she wished to admit, unsettling the careful walls she had spent 2 years building around her heart. On Sunday, walking home from church with her mother, Eleanor caught sight of a familiar carriage pausing at the corner of the street, though it did not stop, and she could not be certain whether the man inside had truly glanced toward her, or whether her own mind had simply conjured the image out of restless hope. She said nothing of it to her mother, who was already humming softly beside her, lighter in spirit than she had been in weeks, ever since the solicitor's visit had confirmed that the house, and their small remaining dignity, would be spared. "You have been quiet all morning," her mother observed as they climbed the front steps. "Is something troubling you, Eleanor?" "No, mother. I am only tired." Her mother studied her, with the particular patience of a woman who had raised a daughter clever enough to hide most things, but never quite clever enough to hide everything. "It is a strange kindness, is it not, from a man you refused so publicly?" "It is business, nothing more," Eleanor said, though the words felt thinner each time she repeated them, as though saying them often enough might make them true. "Perhaps," her mother said, and left it at that, though the small, knowing smile she wore for the rest of the afternoon told Eleanor she was not entirely convinced. That evening, alone in her room, Eleanor took out paper and pen, intending to write a brief note of thanks to be delivered discreetly through the solicitor, nothing more than what propriety demanded. She wrote 3 lines and crossed them out twice, dissatisfied with the coldness of her own words, before finally setting the pen aside altogether, unwilling to examine too closely why plain gratitude proved so difficult to put on paper. Outside her window, London settled into its usual evening hush, carriages rattling home along wet cobblestones, and Eleanor sat by the candlelight a long while, turning over the strange, unwelcome truth that the man she had humiliated before all of society had, in the span of a single afternoon, become the very reason her family still had a home to sleep in. The invitation arrived on cream paper sealed with wax, and Eleanor knew before she broke the seal that her quiet week of relief was about to end. "Lady Farrington's house party," her mother read aloud, delight lighting her tired face. "A full week in the country, Eleanor. It has been so long since we received such an invitation." Eleanor's stomach turned uneasily as she scanned the guest list included on the accompanying card. The Duke of Ashbourne, Lady Margaret Vane, Lord Cassian Vane. Nearly every family of consequence in London, all gathered under one roof for 7 days, with nowhere for Eleanor to hide from the very people she most wished to avoid. "We cannot decline," her mother said, already reaching for paper to compose their acceptance. "It would be seen as an insult, and we cannot afford insults, not now." Eleanor knew she was right. Declining would only fuel the rumors already circulating through every drawing room in London, rumors about her refusal at the opera, about the mysterious resolution of her family's debts, about whispered connections no one could quite prove but everyone seemed eager to imagine. She packed her trunk with a heavy heart and arrived at Farrington Hall 3 days later, the great gray stone house rising out of the misty countryside like something from an old story, its windows glowing gold against the fading afternoon light. Dinner that first evening was an exercise in careful composure. Eleanor was seated, by some cruel accident of placement, directly across from the Duke of Ashbourne, with Lady Margaret Vane positioned close enough to observe every glance, every hesitation, every flicker of expression that passed between them. "Miss Hartley," Julian said, inclining his head in greeting, his tone perfectly polite, perfectly distant, as though the quiet business conducted in her family's drawing room had never happened at all. "I trust you had a pleasant journey." "Pleasant enough, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, matching his careful formality. Lady Margaret's sharp eyes moved between them, missing nothing. "How curious," she said, her voice honeyed and cold all at once, "that you should be seated so near one another, given the rather public nature of your last encounter." "Seating arrangements are hardly a matter of great intrigue, Lady Margaret," Julian said evenly, though something tightened at the corner of his jaw. "Of course not," Margaret said, smiling in a way that suggested she believed precisely the opposite. "Though I confess I have heard the most curious rumors regarding certain business dealings between your solicitor and the Hartley family. Nothing improper, I am sure." Eleanor felt her face grow warm, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I am not aware of any business that would interest the wider company, Lady Margaret." "No, I imagine you would not wish it to interest the wider company," Margaret said, and turned her attention pointedly to her son, seated beside her with an expression of lazy amusement. "Cassian, do tell everyone what you observed at the opera." Cassian's eyes glittered with something close to delight. Only that Miss Hartley displayed remarkable courage in refusing his Grace's invitation, in front of the entire ton, no less. One rarely witnesses such boldness. "Boldness or foolishness," Margaret mused, depending upon one's perspective. Eleanor set down her fork, her appetite gone entirely. "I refused a dance, Lady Margaret, nothing more. I fail to see why the matter continues to warrant such interest." Perhaps because interest tends to follow wherever the Duke's attention lingers, Margaret said, and though her tone remained pleasant, the warning beneath it was unmistakable. Julian's voice cut through the tension with quiet finality. I believe the fish course is growing cold. Perhaps we might speak of something less exhausted than an evening at the opera weeks past. The conversation moved on, though Eleanor felt Margaret's gaze linger on her for the remainder of the meal, sharp and assessing, and she understood with growing certainty that she had made an enemy simply by existing too near the Duke's regard. After dinner, the guests dispersed into the drawing room for cards and conversation, and Eleanor sought refuge on the terrace, grateful for the cool evening air after the suffocating tension of the dining room. She had been standing alone only a few minutes when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Julian approaching, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. You should not be out here alone, Miss Hartley. The gossips inside would delight in the story. The gossips inside delight in every story that involves my name, it seems, whether I am alone or in full view of the entire company. Eleanor turned back toward the darkened garden. I begin to wonder if there is any way to avoid becoming the subject of conversation. There is not, Julian said, coming to stand beside her at the balustrade, careful to maintain a respectable distance. I learned that lesson long ago. One simply learns to endure it, or one lets it consume every moment of peace remaining to them. Which have you chosen, Your Grace? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with more seriousness than she had expected. Endurance, mostly, though I confess it grows more difficult with each passing year. Lady Margaret seems determined to make an example of me. Lady Margaret has spent a great deal of energy these past years, attempting to secure a match between myself and any number of eligible young women, none of whom I have ever encouraged, Julian said. I suspect your refusal at the opera troubled her far more than it troubled me, precisely because it proved I could be refused at all. It disrupts whatever careful plans she nurses for her son's advancement through my favor. Lord Cassian seemed rather pleased by the whole affair. Cassian enjoys chaos, particularly when it does not touch him directly, Julian said, a note of old weariness in his voice. He is my cousin, and I do not dislike him entirely, but I have learned to be cautious of his enjoyment. It rarely comes without cost to someone else. Eleanor considered this, turning to study his profile in the moonlight, the sharp line of his jaw, the tired set of his shoulders that spoke of burdens she had not previously considered a duke might carry. May I ask you something honestly, Your Grace? You may. Why did you truly help my family? I have turned the question over countless times, and I cannot make the answer sit comfortably with what I know of men in your position. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dark shapes of the garden below. My father built our family's fortune through ruthlessness, Miss Hartley. He ruined more than one family who could not repay a debt, and called it sound business practice. I inherited his title, his wealth, and, for many years, his methods, until I came to understand what that ruthlessness had cost the people it touched, and what it had cost me as well. I do not wish to be the kind of man he was. Helping your family was, in part, a small correction against that inheritance. That is a heavier answer than I expected, Eleanor admitted quietly. You did ask honestly, he said, the faintest trace of a smile touching his mouth. I thought you deserved an honest answer in return. They stood together in silence for a while, the distant sound of laughter and music drifting from the drawing room behind them, and Eleanor found herself, against every instinct of caution she had cultivated these past 2 years, reluctant to return inside and end the quiet moment. I should go back before Lady Margaret sends a search party, she said finally. Of course. Julian straightened, the careful distance returning to his posture. Miss Hartley, Eleanor, if I may. She turned back, surprised by the sudden informality. I do not ask for your trust, he said. I only ask that you do not condemn me for the sins of men who came before me, myself included. Eleanor held his gaze a moment longer than propriety allowed. I will try, Your Grace. She returned to the drawing room with her pulse unsteady and her thoughts in disarray, and did not notice, until it was too late, that Lord Cassian Vane stood near the terrace doors, watching the space where she and Julian had stood together, with an expression of calculating interest that boded ill for whatever plans he was already beginning to construct. The following morning, Eleanor rose early, hoping to walk the grounds before the rest of the house party stirred, only to find Cassian waiting near the stables, as though he had anticipated her habits. Miss Hartley, he said, falling into step beside her uninvited. You seem determined to avoid company this morning. I seek only quiet, Lord Vane, nothing more sinister than that. Quiet is a rare commodity in a house full of gossips, he agreed pleasantly. Though I noticed you found a moment of it last evening, on the terrace, with my cousin. Eleanor's steps did not falter, though her chest tightened. His Grace and I spoke briefly. There is no scandal in conversation, Lord Vane. No scandal yet, Cassian said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Though I wonder how long that remains true, given how quickly whispers travel in a house such as this. My mother, in particular, takes great interest in such matters. Your mother's interests are her own affair. I have done nothing improper. Improper is a matter of perspective, Miss Hartley. A woman with debts recently forgiven by a duke, seen alone with that same duke under moonlight, might find her reputation questioned regardless of how innocent the conversation truly was. Cassian's smile did not waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes. I say this not as a threat, you understand, but as a friendly warning. My mother does not forgive easily, and she has a particular talent for turning whispers into ruin. Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Why does this concern you so deeply, Lord Vane? What precisely do you fear from a simple conversation shared between two people on a terrace? Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. I fear nothing, Miss Hartley. I merely wish to see you protected from consequences you may not fully understand. This world can be unkind to women who rise too quickly, particularly women without the fortune to weather scandal comfortably. Then perhaps you might extend that same protection by refraining from spreading rumors yourself, Eleanor said, and left him standing in the misty morning garden, her heart pounding with an unease she could not entirely explain. That afternoon, Lady Farrington organized a walk through the ornamental gardens for her guests, insisting that fresh air would do everyone good after the previous evening's rich meal and richer conversation. Eleanor walked near the back of the group, hoping to avoid notice, but found herself, by some arrangement she suspected was not entirely accidental, paired with Julian along a narrow gravel path lined with late roses. You seem determined to keep your distance today, Julian observed, his tone light, though his eyes studied her with quiet attention. Lord Vane offered me a warning this morning, Eleanor said, deciding honesty served her better than pretense. He suggested that further conversation between us might invite consequences I would not enjoy. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Cassian enjoys positioning himself as a protector when it suits his purposes. I would advise caution in trusting his warnings at face value. You believe he has other motives. I believe my cousin rarely does anything without calculating what he stands to gain, Julian said. Though I confess I cannot yet determine what he hopes to gain from concerning himself with your reputation. They walked in silence for a moment, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet, the scent of late roses heavy in the cooling autumn air. May I ask you something in return, Your Grace? You may. Why have you never married? A man of your position, your fortune, surely could have secured any match he desired years ago. Julian's expression grew distant, as though the question led him somewhere he did not often allow himself to go. I was engaged once, many years ago, to a woman my father selected for the advantage it would bring our family's holdings. She did not love me, nor I her, though we might have managed a tolerable arrangement regardless. She ended the engagement herself, in the end, for a wealthier prospect who offered better connections abroad. I learned then that most who seek my company seek my title and fortune first, and whatever remains of the man beneath only after those questions are settled. That sounds a lonely way to live, Eleanor said quietly. It has been, he admitted, surprising her with the plainness of the confession. Until recently, I had grown accustomed to the loneliness, had even convinced myself it suited me well enough. I find that conviction has grown more difficult to maintain of late. Eleanor did not ask what he meant by that, though her heart beat strangely fast as they continued along the path, and she suspected, from the careful way he avoided her gaze afterward, that he had said more than he intended. They rejoined the larger group near the ornamental fountain at the center of the garden, where Lady Margaret waited with an expression of polite interest that did not quite mask the sharpness beneath it. You two seem to have found a great deal to discuss, Margaret observed, her gaze flickering between them. The roses are unusually fine this season, Julian said smoothly, offering no further explanation, though Eleanor noticed the faint color that had risen in his own face, an unfamiliar sight on a man so carefully composed. Margaret did not look convinced, though she said nothing further, and the group moved on toward the house as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening. She did not see Julian again until luncheon, seated once more within Lady Margaret's watchful range, and though neither of them spoke of the terrace, nor of the conversation shared beneath the moonlight, Eleanor felt the weight of it lingering between them regardless, a quiet understanding neither dared acknowledge aloud, while across the table, Cassian watched them both with the patient, calculating attention of a man already assembling the pieces of some private design. That evening, while the household gathered for cards, Lady Margaret drew her son aside into the quiet of the library, her voice low and urgent once the door had closed behind them. "You have seen it as clearly as I have," she said. "He watches that girl as he has watched no other woman in years. If this continues, everything we have worked toward will collapse before it begins." "I have seen it," Cassian said, pouring himself a measure of brandy with unhurried calm. "Though I confess, Mother, I find the girl rather more clever than I expected. She will not be easily frightened away." "Then we shall have to be more persuasive than fear," Margaret said, her eyes narrowing with quiet calculation. "Every woman has a weakness, Cassian. Find hers, and we will end this before it costs us everything." "And if her weakness proves to be Julian himself?" Margaret's smile turned cold. "Then we shall simply have to ensure he believes the very worst of her, before he allows himself to believe anything else at all." Cassian said nothing, though he turned his glass slowly in his hand, already turning over the shape of a plan far more dangerous than either Eleanor or Julian yet suspected, one that would not wait long to reveal itself. Rain kept the house party guests indoors for the third day running, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the excuse to avoid the archery lawn where Lady Margaret held court each afternoon, dispensing thinly veiled cruelty disguised as conversation. She had taken refuge in the library, a quiet room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and old paper, when the door opened and Julian entered, clearly expecting solitude of his own. "Forgive me," he said, pausing at the threshold. "I did not realize the room was occupied." "You need not apologize, Your Grace. The library is hardly my private property." He hesitated a moment longer, then crossed to the shelves near where she sat, selecting a volume with the ease of a man familiar with the collection. "Lady Farrington keeps a fine library, better than my own in certain respects, though I would never admit that within her hearing." Eleanor set aside the book she had been pretending to read for the past half hour. "You seem more at ease here than at dinner." "Books do not ask questions, nor spread rumors, nor calculate advantage from every word spoken," Julian said, settling into the chair across from her with a faint, tired smile. "I confess I have always preferred their company to most gatherings of this kind. That surprises me, given how easily you command a room when you choose to." "Commanding a room and enjoying it are two entirely different matters, Miss Hartley." He turned the book over in his hands without opening it, his gaze distant. "I learned long ago that a duke is expected to perform a certain role, regardless of what he might feel beneath it. Confidence, authority, indifference to the opinions of lesser men. I have grown skilled at the performance, though it has cost me more than I care to admit." Eleanor studied him, struck by the rare honesty in his voice, so different from the polished distance he wore at dinner each evening. "What would you be, if you did not have to perform that role?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was quiet for a long moment, turning it over with evident care before answering. "I do not know precisely. A man who spent more time with his tenants than his ledgers, perhaps. A man who traveled without an entourage announcing his arrival 3 days in advance. I sometimes envy men of lesser fortune, strange as that must sound. Their choices are narrower, but they are, at least, their own." "It does not sound strange," Eleanor said softly. "I have spent 2 years watching my own choices narrow to almost nothing. And I have envied, more than once, women with the freedom to simply live without the weight of a family's survival resting on every decision they make. Your refusal at the opera did not seem the choice of a woman without freedom." "It was the one choice I had left to make entirely my own," Eleanor admitted. "Every other decision in my life these past 2 years has been shaped by necessity. Whom to befriend, whom to avoid, which invitations we could afford to accept and which we could not. Refusing you was, perhaps foolishly, the one moment I claimed for myself alone." Julian's expression softened into something Eleanor had not seen from him before, an unguarded warmth that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "I do not think it foolish at all. I think it was the bravest thing I have witnessed in a very long time." The rain continued to patter softly against the tall windows, and for a while neither of them spoke, content in a silence that felt, strangely, more intimate than any conversation Eleanor had shared in months. "May I tell you something I have not told anyone else in this house?" Julian asked finally. "You may. My father did not simply build his fortune through business acumen. He built it, in part, by ruining a family much like your own, early in his career, a family who could not repay a debt owed to him, and whom he pursued without mercy until they lost everything, including, eventually, their eldest son to a fever brought on by the stress of their poverty. I did not learn the full truth of it until after his death, When I found the correspondence among his private papers, Julian's voice grew quieter, heavier with old grief. I have spent every year since trying to be a different sort of man than he was, though I confess I am not always certain I succeed. You succeed more than you know, Eleanor said, moved despite herself by the rawness of the confession. My family would have lost everything without your intervention. You did not have to help us. Many men in your position would have seen our misfortune as simply the natural order of things. Perhaps, but I have seen too clearly what that natural order costs the people caught beneath it. He met her eyes then, something vulnerable and searching in his expression. I did not help your family solely out of correction for my father's sins, Eleanor. I want you to know that. I helped because I could not stop thinking of you, long after that evening at the opera. And I found I did not wish to be the kind of man who let pride, yours or mine, stand between a family and their survival. Eleanor's breath caught. She had not expected such plain honesty, had not prepared herself for the way it settled warm and unsettling in her chest. Your Grace, Julian, he said quietly. When we are alone, I would ask that you call me Julian. Julian, she repeated, testing the name, and found she liked the shape of it far more than propriety allowed her to admit. The library door opened suddenly, and both of them straightened as Charlotte entered, her eyes widening slightly at the scene before her, though she recovered quickly, offering a bright, unbothered smile. There you are, Eleanor. Lady Farrington has organized charades in the drawing room, and I feared you had gotten lost among the shelves entirely. Her gaze flickered briefly to Julian, curious but tactful. Your Grace. Miss Charlotte. Julian rose smoothly, the careful formality returning to his posture like a mask settling back into place. I believe I have kept Miss Hartley from more entertaining company long enough. Eleanor rose as well, her heart still unsteady from the conversation, and followed Charlotte toward the door, though she paused briefly at the threshold and glanced back. Julian remained standing near the window, watching her go, and in the fading gray light of the rainy afternoon, he looked, for just a moment, less like a duke burdened by title and inheritance, and more like simply a man who had allowed himself, however briefly, to be known. Later that evening, as the household gathered for charades, Eleanor found her attention drifting repeatedly toward Julian across the crowded drawing room, and more than once caught him watching her in return, before one of them looked away, careful to guard whatever had passed between them in the quiet of the library. Charlotte pulled her aside near the refreshment table, her expression a careful mixture of concern and curiosity. Eleanor, whatever occurred in that library, you must be careful. Lady Margaret's eyes miss nothing, and I fear what she might do if she suspects the truth of what I believe I just witnessed. Nothing improper occurred, Charlotte. We spoke, that is all. I believe you, Charlotte said gently, but I do not believe that is all it was, not from the look on your face just now, nor from the look on his. Eleanor did not answer, because she did not trust herself to speak the truth aloud, not even to her closest confidant. Something had shifted that afternoon in the quiet library, something she could not yet name, and something she feared, with growing certainty, she would not be able to simply set aside once the house party ended and the ordinary world reclaimed them both. Later, as the guests began retiring for the night, Cassian approached Eleanor near the base of the grand staircase, his manner as pleasant and unthreatening as ever, though something in his eyes had sharpened since the library incident. You seem in good spirits this evening, Miss Hartley, he said. The library must have offered pleasant company. I do not believe that is any concern of yours, Lord Vane. Perhaps not, he agreed easily, though I find myself curious how a woman in your position intends to navigate what comes next. My cousin is not a man given to idle attention, Miss Hartley. Whatever he feels deeply, and rarely does he allow himself such indulgence. If you have captured his notice, you must understand what that means for the both of you, and for the many who will not stand quietly by and watch it unfold. Are you warning me, or threatening me, Lord Vane? I confess I can no longer tell the difference in your conversation. I am merely observing, Cassian said, his smile thinning slightly. Though I would advise you to consider carefully what you stand to lose, should matters between you and my cousin become the subject of scandal, rather than quiet admiration. Society is far kinder to a duke's private interests than to the woman who becomes their subject. He bowed and departed before she could respond, leaving her standing alone at the base of the staircase with her earlier warmth curdling slowly into unease. She thought of her family's fragile finances, still recovering, still dependent in part on the very man whose attention now threatened to become a liability rather than a rescue. She thought of her mother's hopeful eyes, her father's restored dignity, and wondered, not for the first time, whether happiness and safety were destined to remain forever at odds in her life. She climbed the stairs slowly, her mind turning over Cassian's words long after she had retired to her room, and found sleep slow to come, chased away by equal measures of hope and dread that refused to settle into anything resembling peace. The following morning the rain finally cleared, and Lady Farrington announced a ride through the eastern woodland trails for those guests inclined toward exercise. Eleanor joined reluctantly, hoping the fresh air might clear the tangled thoughts that had kept her awake, and found herself once again riding near Julian, though this time by clear intention rather than accident, as he guided his horse alongside hers along the narrow forest path. "You seem troubled this morning," he observed, watching her carefully. "Has something occurred?" "Your cousin offered me a rather pointed warning last evening," Eleanor admitted, deciding once more that honesty served her better than careful evasion. "He suggested that whatever exists between us, however slight, invites consequences neither of us may wish to bear." Julian's expression darkened. Cassian has never approved of anything that threatens the careful order he and his mother wish to maintain. I would not place too much weight on his warnings, Eleanor, though I understand why they trouble you. He is not entirely wrong, is he? A scandal involving your name and mine would cost me a great deal more than it would cost you. My family has only just begun to recover. I cannot afford to risk what little stability remains to us for the sake of a connection that may lead nowhere beyond gossip and ruin. Julian reined his horse to a slow stop, and Eleanor followed suit, the forest quiet around them save for the distant calls of birds and the soft rustle of wind through autumn leaves. "I will not pretend the risk does not exist," he said finally. "But I would ask you to trust that I do not offer my regard lightly, nor would I allow you or your family to bear the cost of it alone. Whatever comes of this, Eleanor, I intend to see you protected, whatever the gossips choose to say. That is easy to promise in a quiet forest, Julian. It may prove harder to keep once we return to London and its endless appetite for scandal." "Then let me prove it through action rather than promise," he said quietly. "Give me the chance to show you I mean what I say, rather than dismissing me now out of fear of what others might think." Eleanor searched his face for a long moment, torn between the caution 2 years of hardship had taught her, and the quiet, insistent hope that had been growing steadily since that first uninvited visit to her family's drawing room. "I do not know if I am brave enough for that, Julian." "You refused a duke in front of all of London without flinching," he said, the faintest smile touching his mouth. "I think you are brave enough for a great deal more than you credit yourself." They rode on in a silence that felt, this time, less uncertain than before, though the memory of Cassian's warning lingered at the edges of Eleanor's thoughts, a quiet shadow she could not quite outride, no matter how far the woodland trail carried them from the house and its watchful eyes. Across the room, Lord Cassian Vane watched the exchange between the cousins with quiet interest, his expression giving away nothing of the careful plan already taking shape behind his composed smile, a plan he intended to set into motion before another week had passed. The letter arrived on Eleanor's writing desk 3 days after the house party ended, sealed with wax that bore no crest, and she felt a cold premonition settle over her the moment she broke it open. The handwriting was not Julian's, though it claimed to be a copy of correspondence between him and Lady Margaret, detailing an arrangement in which he agreed to court Eleanor purely to spite his cousin's ambitions, with no intention of ever offering marriage, and a promise to end the connection quietly once it had served its purpose in unsettling Margaret's plans for Cassian. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her hands growing colder with each pass, before Charlotte found her sitting motionless in the drawing room, the paper still clutched in her trembling fingers. "Eleanor, what is it? You look as though you have seen a ghost." Wordlessly, Eleanor handed her the letter, watching Charlotte's face shift from confusion to horror as she read. "This cannot be genuine," Charlotte said, though uncertainty colored her voice. "Where did it come from?" "It was delivered anonymously, left with the housemaid before I had risen this morning." Eleanor's voice sounded distant even to her own ears. "But the details, Charlotte, the specific mention of the terrace conversation, of the library, of things only a handful of people could possibly know." "Someone close to the house party then," Charlotte said slowly. "Someone who wished you to believe the worst." "Or someone reporting the truth," Eleanor said, and felt something inside her chest crack, quiet and final, like ice giving way beneath careless footsteps. "I was a fool, Charlotte. I let myself believe a duke's attention could be anything but a game to men of his position. I let myself forget every lesson 2 years of hardship taught me." "You do not know this is true," Charlotte insisted. "Julian has shown you nothing but sincerity, since the moment he first called upon your family." He has shown me exactly what a clever man shows a woman he intends to use, Eleanor said, bitterness creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. Kindness disguised as honesty, vulnerability disguised as trust. I have seen this performance before, Charlotte, though I never imagined it could be played so skillfully. She spent the rest of the day in a haze of quiet devastation, replaying every conversation, every unguarded moment shared with Julian, searching for evidence of the deception the letter described, and finding, to her growing despair, that uncertainty made every memory suspect. Had his confession about his father been genuine, or merely a well-rehearsed performance designed to win her trust? Had the warmth in his eyes on the terrace been real, or simply the practiced expression of a man skilled at appearing sincere? That evening, a note arrived from Julian himself, requesting permission to call upon her the following afternoon, his handwriting familiar and steady across the page. Eleanor stared at it for a long while, before finally setting it aside, unanswered, unable to summon the composure required to face him, while the wound from the anonymous letter remained so raw. He called regardless, arriving at the appointed hour despite her silence, and Eleanor found herself unable to refuse him entry, though every instinct urged her toward retreat. "You did not respond to my note," Julian said, studying her carefully as he entered the drawing room. "I feared something had happened." "Something has happened," Eleanor said, her voice colder than she intended, though she could not soften it, not with the letter's accusations still echoing through her thoughts. "I received a letter yesterday, Julian. One that described, in considerable detail, an arrangement between yourself and Lady Margaret, regarding a courtship undertaken purely to spite Lord Cassian's ambitions, with no true intention behind it." Julian's expression shifted through confusion, then dawning alarm. "Eleanor, whatever you received, I assure you it is not true. I have made no such arrangement with my cousin, nor would I ever treat your regard so carelessly. The letter knew of our conversation on the terrace, Julian. It knew of the library, of things I told no one beyond Charlotte." Eleanor's voice trembled despite her efforts to remain steady. "How am I to believe this is mere coincidence? I do not know how such details came to be known," Julian said, his own voice rising with frustration, and something that looked, to Eleanor's wary eyes, dangerously close to guilt. "But I swear to you, whatever that letter claims, it is a fabrication, designed to drive us apart." "Designed by whom, Julian? Who would go to such lengths, unless there was some truth beneath the accusation to give it weight?" "I do not know," he said, though something in his hesitation, brief as it was, planted a seed of doubt that bloomed swiftly into something far darker in Eleanor's already wounded heart. Perhaps Cassian, perhaps my own aunt, desperate to end whatever they perceive growing between us. "Or perhaps," Eleanor said, her voice breaking despite her effort to hold it steady, "there is no fabrication at all, and I have simply been foolish enough to believe a duke's kindness could exist without a hidden purpose behind it." "Eleanor, please, you must believe me." "I do not know what to believe anymore," she said, and the honesty of it hurt more than any accusation could have. "I want to believe you, Julian. That frightens me more than the letter itself." Julian crossed the room toward her, his expression pleading in a way she had never seen from him before, all careful composure abandoned. "Then trust that fear, rather than the anonymous cruelty of a letter with no name attached to it. I have given you every honest piece of myself I possess these past weeks. I would not undo that now with a lie so easily disproven. Were you willing to give me the chance to prove it?" Before Eleanor could respond, the drawing room door opened, and her mother entered, her face pale with an urgency that immediately overshadowed the tension already thick in the room. "Eleanor, forgive the interruption, but there is a matter requiring your immediate attention. Lady Margaret Vane has called, and she insists on speaking with you directly, regarding a matter she describes as most delicate." Eleanor's stomach dropped further still. She glanced at Julian, whose expression had gone carefully blank, the mask of composure sliding back into place even as alarm flickered behind his eyes. "Send her in," Eleanor said quietly, bracing herself for whatever new complication awaited. Lady Margaret entered with the satisfied air of a woman who had anticipated this exact confrontation, and prepared for it thoroughly. Her gaze swept over the scene before her, Julian standing near Eleanor with obvious distress, and something like triumph flickered briefly across her composed features. "Miss Hartley," Margaret said, inclining her head with icy politeness, "I see you have already received the correspondence I arranged to have delivered." The room went utterly still. Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her, her earlier suspicion crystallizing into cold, undeniable confirmation. "You sent the letter." "I did," Margaret said, without a trace of shame. "Every word of it true. gathered from my son's careful observation these past weeks. I will not stand by and watch my nephew's foolish infatuation threaten the future I have worked to secure for my own son." "That is a lie," Julian said sharply, rounding on his aunt with an anger Eleanor had never witnessed from him before. "I made no arrangement with you regarding Eleanor. You have fabricated this entirely." "Have I?" Margaret's smile was thin and cold. "Or have you simply forgotten the conversation we shared at Farrington Hall, when I warned you that this attachment would bring nothing but scandal upon our family's name, and you assured me you understood the risk and intended to proceed carefully regardless?" "A conversation twisted entirely from its original meaning," Julian said, though Eleanor noted, with a fresh stab of pain, that he did not deny the conversation itself had occurred. "Twisted or not," Margaret said, turning her attention back to Eleanor with cool satisfaction, "the truth remains that my nephew's family will never accept a connection to yours, Miss Hartley, regardless of whatever tender feelings may have grown between you these past weeks. I suggest you spare yourself further humiliation and end this foolishness now, before it costs you more than your family's fragile reputation can bear." Eleanor stood frozen, torn between the plain, undeniable fact of the conversation Margaret described and Julian's desperate denial of its meaning, unable to determine, in the chaos of the moment, where truth ended and manipulation began. "You would take her word over mine, after everything I have shown you these past weeks?" Julian asked, his voice low with disbelief and hurt. "I take no one's word entirely, Julian. Not yours, not hers. I only ask for the chance to think clearly, which has proven impossible since the moment that letter arrived at my door." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly at her sides, though she kept her voice level through sheer force of will. "You must understand how this appears to me. A woman with everything to lose, caught between a duke's affection and his family's scheming, with no way to know for certain which parts of either account are true. I think," Eleanor said finally, her voice steadier than she felt, "that you should both leave. I require time to consider what has been said here today, without either of you attempting to shape my understanding of it further." Julian's face fell, wounded by the request, though he did not argue. "Eleanor, please, do not let her words—" "I am asking for time, Julian, not condemnation," Eleanor said, though the words cost her more than she cared to admit. "Please, respect that much at least." He hesitated a long moment, then bowed stiffly and departed, Margaret following with a final, satisfied glance that made Eleanor's skin crawl with fresh anger. Once they had gone, Eleanor sank into a chair, her composure finally breaking, tears she had held back through the entire confrontation now falling freely. Charlotte found her there an hour later, still and silent, the anonymous letter crumpled in her lap. "What will you do?" Charlotte asked gently, settling beside her. "I do not know," Eleanor admitted. "I want to believe him, Charlotte. Every instinct tells me Margaret has twisted the truth to serve her own purposes, but I cannot ignore that he did not deny the conversation itself occurred, only its meaning. And I cannot risk my family's future on a hope that may prove nothing more than another clever man's charm, dressed up as sincerity." "Then perhaps," Charlotte said carefully, "you must seek the truth yourself, rather than trusting either his word or hers alone." Eleanor considered this through the long, sleepless night that followed, and by morning had resolved on a single, uncertain course of action. She would write to Julian's own household, discreetly, through a contact Charlotte's family maintained among the Ashbourne staff, and learn, if she could, whether any truth existed beneath Margaret's cruel accusation, before she allowed herself to trust, or to grieve, any further. 3 days passed before Charlotte's contact. A housekeeper named Hannah Whitfield, who had served the Ashbourne family for over a decade, agreed to meet Eleanor quietly at a small tea house away from prying eyes. "I do not usually speak of my employer's private affairs," the housekeeper said, glancing nervously toward the door as she settled into her seat. "But Miss Charlotte tells me it concerns a matter of some importance to you, and I have always found His Grace to be a fair and honest employer, unlike some I have served." "I only wish to know the truth," Eleanor said, "whatever it may be. I received a letter claiming His Grace arranged a false courtship with me, purely to spite his cousin, at Lady Margaret's suggestion." The housekeeper's eyebrows rose sharply. "That does not sound like the man I know, miss, if you will forgive my speaking plainly. His Grace has spoken little of personal matters to the staff, as is proper, but I have observed him closely these 15 years, and I have never seen him so altered as these past weeks. He hums now, miss, walking through the halls in the morning. He has not hummed since he was a boy, before his father's passing." Eleanor's chest tightened at the small, unexpected detail. "Did you ever hear mention of an arrangement between His Grace and Lady Margaret regarding myself?" I heard Lady Margaret visit twice this past month, both times leaving in considerable temper, the housekeeper said. The second time, I overheard raised voices through the study door, though I could not make out every word. His Grace said something to the effect that he would not be dictated to regarding matters of his own heart, and that Lady Margaret's schemes for her son's advancement were her own concern, not his to solve through manipulation of an innocent woman. Eleanor sat very still, turning the housekeeper's account over carefully. It did not prove the letter false entirely, but it painted a picture far different from the calculated cruelty Margaret had described, a man defending Eleanor, rather than conspiring against her. "Thank you," Eleanor said finally. "You have given me a great deal to consider." "I hope it brings you some comfort, miss," the housekeeper said, rising to take her leave. "For what little my opinion is worth, I have not seen His Grace look at any woman the way he looks at you. That is not a performance easily maintained behind closed doors, where no audience remains to witness it." Eleanor returned home with her thoughts in greater turmoil than before, torn between the housekeeper's account and the memory of Julian's telling hesitation when confronted with Margaret's accusation. She wanted desperately to believe the housekeeper's version of events, yet 2 years of hard-learned caution warned her against trusting hope too quickly, lest it prove, once again, a costly mistake. That evening, she sat with her father in his study, seeking counsel she had avoided asking for, out of pride these past difficult weeks. "You have grown quiet these past days," her father observed, setting aside his ledger. "Since the house party, I think, though you have said little of what troubles you." Eleanor told him everything then. The letter, Margaret's confrontation, the housekeeper's account, and her own uncertain heart caught between them all. Her father listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. "I cannot tell you what to feel, Eleanor," he said finally. "But I will tell you this. When His Grace sat in this very room, discussing the settlement of our debts, he asked for nothing in return. Not once. Not even a private word of gratitude beyond what courtesy required. A man capable of such quiet generosity, expecting nothing in return, does not strike me as a man capable of the calculated cruelty that letter describes." Lady Margaret seemed entirely convinced of her own account. "Lady Margaret," her father said dryly, "strikes me as a woman more concerned with her son's advancement than with truth. I would weigh her word carefully against everything else you have observed of His Grace these past weeks, rather than allowing her account to outweigh your own experience simply because it arrived wrapped in urgency and alarm." Eleanor considered his words long into the night, and found, by morning, that something in her had shifted, not quite trust restored, but something close enough to hope that she resolved, finally, to seek Julian out herself, to hear his full account without his aunt's interference, before allowing Margaret's cruelty to decide the matter for her. Meanwhile, across London, in a quiet study lit by a single guttering candle, Lord Cassian Vane read his mother's account of the confrontation with quiet satisfaction, already turning his attention toward the next piece of his careful design, one that would ensure, regardless of whatever truth Eleanor uncovered, that the damage already done would prove impossible to fully undo. Eleanor sent word to Julian the following morning, requesting he call upon her that afternoon, alone, and received his reply within the hour, brief and immediate, agreeing to come at once. She waited in the drawing room, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread she could not fully separate, until the sound of his carriage arriving outside brought her to her feet. Julian entered looking as though he had not slept, dark circles beneath his eyes, his usual composure worn thin at the edges. "Eleanor, thank you for allowing me to come." "I spoke with your housekeeper," Eleanor said, deciding to begin plainly, rather than delay the matter further. "Mrs. Whitfield, she told me of an argument between yourself and Lady Margaret, one in which you refused, quite firmly, to be dictated to, regarding matters of your own heart." Julian's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something like relief. "That argument occurred exactly as she described, I imagine. Margaret came to me weeks ago, suggesting that my attention toward you might prove useful in discouraging certain rumors regarding Cassian's own romantic entanglements, rumors she wished quietly buried. I refused her outright, Eleanor, and told her in no uncertain terms that whatever grew between us was not a tool to be used for her son's advantage. Then the conversation existed, but not as she described it to me. Twisted entirely as I told you, Julian said. She took the barest fragment of truth, that a conversation occurred at all, and built around it a fabrication designed to make you doubt everything I have shown you since the moment I first called upon your family. Eleanor studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the calculated performance she had feared, and found instead only quiet, exhausted sincerity. Why did you hesitate, Julian, when Margaret confronted us? You did not deny the conversation had occurred, only its meaning. That hesitation cost me more sleepless hours than I care to admit. I hesitated because I did not wish to lie, even by omission, and because the truth of that conversation was tangled enough that I feared explaining it poorly would only deepen your doubt, rather than ease it, Julian admitted. I see now that my silence did more damage than honesty would have. I am sorry for that, Eleanor, more than I can properly express. Before Eleanor could respond, the drawing room door opened abruptly, and her father entered, his face tight with barely controlled fury, a crumpled paper in his hand. Eleanor, Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but I believe you both should see this immediately. He handed the paper to Julian, who scanned it quickly, his own expression darkening with each line. Eleanor moved closer to read over his shoulder, and felt her stomach drop as the full scope of the deception unfolded before her. It was a letter from Lord Cassian Vane to a moneylender known for less than honest dealings, dated weeks before the anonymous letter had arrived at Eleanor's door, requesting a substantial sum to be delivered discreetly, along with instructions to draft correspondence in a hand resembling Julian's own, detailing a false arrangement regarding a courtship undertaken to spite Cassian's own supposed ambitions. The letter had somehow found its way into her father's hands through a clerk who recognized the moneylender's involvement in both transactions and, troubled by conscience, delivered the evidence anonymously that very morning. Cassian forged the letter entirely, Julian said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Not Margaret's twisted account of a real conversation, but an outright fabrication, crafted deliberately to destroy any trust between us. But why? Eleanor asked, though even as she spoke, understanding began to dawn, cold and certain. What could he possibly gain from such deliberate cruelty? Everything, Julian said grimly. If I remained unmarried, distracted and estranged from any woman who might genuinely love me rather than my title, Cassian remains my presumptive heir, given I have no closer family beyond him. A marriage built on genuine affection threatens that inheritance far more than any arrangement of convenience ever could. He did not fear scandal touching your reputation, Eleanor. He feared losing his own claim to everything I possess. The pieces settled into place with sickening clarity. Eleanor thought of Cassian's careful warnings at the house party, disguised as friendly concern, each one calculated to plant doubt precisely where it would do the most damage. We must confront him, her father said. Such deception cannot go unanswered. It will not, Julian said, his voice hardening with resolve. But I would ask first, for a private word with Eleanor, if you would permit it. Her father nodded and withdrew, leaving them alone once more in the quiet drawing room, though the tension between them had shifted entirely from suspicion into something far more fragile and hopeful. Eleanor, Julian said, crossing the room to stand before her, I understand if the events of these past days have shaken whatever trust we managed to build between us. I understand if you require time yet, even now that the truth has come to light. But I would ask you to know, without any doubt remaining, that everything I have told you these past weeks has been entirely true. My admiration for you, my regard, has grown into something I have not felt for any woman in all my years, and I would not have it destroyed by my cousin's greed and cruelty, not while I still have breath to correct the damage he has caused. I believed the worst of you, even briefly, Eleanor said quietly, guilt coloring her voice. I let fear override everything my own heart had come to know of your character. You had every reason for caution, Julian said gently. I do not fault you for it. I only hope you will allow me the chance to prove, through the years ahead, rather than a single conversation, that your trust was not misplaced. The words settled over Eleanor with quiet, overwhelming warmth, dissolving the last of the fear that had gripped her since the anonymous letter first arrived. I do not need years to know my own heart, Julian, though I confess I would welcome them regardless. He reached for her hand then, his fingers warm and steady around hers. Eleanor Hartley, I have spent my entire life being courted for my title and fortune, and I had long ago resigned myself to a marriage built on convenience rather than genuine affection. You refused me, publicly, without a moment's hesitation, and in doing so, showed me the first honest response I had received from anyone in years. I do not ask you to accept me now out of gratitude, nor obligation, nor even out of the resolution of this unfortunate scheme. I ask you because I love you, plainly and completely, and because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life without you beside me. Tears gathered unbidden in Eleanor's eyes, born not of sorrow but of relief, so complete it nearly overwhelmed her. I love you as well, Julian. I have for some time now, though I was too frightened to name it, even to myself. He drew her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, Eleanor? Not out of necessity, nor rescue, but out of the same honest choice you made that evening at the opera, when you refused me before all the world." "Yes," Eleanor said, laughter and tears mingling in her voice. "Yes, Julian, I will." In the days that followed their engagement, Julian moved carefully and deliberately, gathering every piece of evidence needed to expose his cousin's scheme beyond any possibility of doubt. He consulted his solicitor, arranged for the moneylender to be questioned formally, and secured written testimony from the clerk who had first uncovered the forged instructions, ensuring that when the truth finally emerged, it would do so with a force that left no room for Cassian or his mother to twist the narrative once more in their favor. "You seem determined to make this a public matter," Eleanor observed one evening, as they reviewed the gathered evidence together in his study. "Would it not be simpler to address it quietly, and let Cassian depart without further scandal?" "It would be simpler," Julian agreed. "But it would also leave your name shadowed by whispers that were never fully answered, and I will not allow that, not when the truth can clear it entirely. You deserve to walk through every drawing room in London without a single lingering doubt attached to your name." 2 weeks later, Lord Cassian Vane's scheme unraveled entirely before the assembled company of London's most prominent families, gathered at a hastily arranged gathering hosted by Julian himself. Cassian arrived expecting an ordinary evening of cards and conversation, and paled visibly the moment he saw the moneylender standing near the drawing-room entrance, flanked by Julian's solicitor and a magistrate quietly invited for the occasion. "What is the meaning of this?" Cassian demanded, though his voice already carried the thin edge of a man who understood, on some level, that his careful design had finally come undone. "The meaning," Julian said, his voice calm and carrying easily across the hushed room, "is that the truth of your forgery will no longer remain hidden behind my aunt's convenient fabrications, nor your own careful denials." The moneylender, faced with legal consequence for his role in the forgery, provided full testimony regarding the payment and instructions he had received from Cassian, and the clerk's original letter, verified by independent examination of the handwriting, left no room for doubt regarding the truth of the matter. Lady Margaret, faced with the ruin of her son's reputation rather than Eleanor's, attempted a final, desperate defense, insisting she had known nothing of the forgery herself, though few in attendance believed her claim of innocence entirely, given her own role in twisting the earlier, genuine conversation to serve her purposes. Cassian, stripped of any remaining credibility among polite society, departed London within the month for the continent, his prospects as Julian's heir and his standing among the ton equally ruined by the very scheme he had crafted to protect them both. Eleanor stood beside Julian throughout the entire painful unraveling, her hand steady in his, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that she felt no satisfaction in Cassian's downfall, only relief that the truth had finally emerged, and gratitude that she had trusted her own heart enough, in the end, to seek that truth rather than accept the comfortable lie designed to keep them apart. Word of the scandal, and of the genuine love story beneath it, spread through London within days, transforming Eleanor almost overnight from a woman whispered about with suspicion into one admired for her courage and discernment. Invitations that had once been extended out of curiosity now arrived out of genuine warmth, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in 2 long years, able to move through society without the constant weight of her family's fragile reputation pressing against every interaction. Her father's business, freed from the crushing weight of debt, began slowly to recover, aided in part by Julian's continued fair dealings and in part by her father's own renewed confidence, restored by months of dignity rather than desperation. Her mother, who had spent so many nights weeping quietly over letters from creditors, now spent her evenings planning a wedding she had once feared she would never live to see, her laughter returning gradually to fill the townhouse that had so nearly been lost. Charlotte, delighted beyond measure at the outcome she had quietly hoped for since the very first evening at the opera, took to reminding Eleanor at every opportunity that she had suspected the truth of Julian's affection long before Eleanor allowed herself to believe it. "I told you," Charlotte said one afternoon as they sat together selecting fabric for the wedding gown, "that a man does not visit a struggling family's drawing room himself, rather than sending a solicitor entirely, unless something more than business draws him there." "You told me no such thing," Eleanor said, laughing despite herself. "You told me I had lost my senses for refusing him at the opera." "Well," Charlotte said, entirely unbothered, "I may have revised my opinion rather quickly afterward." Lady Margaret, for her part, retreated from society entirely within weeks of her son's disgrace, her once formidable influence among the ton crumbling swiftly once its foundation of careful manipulation had been exposed for what it truly was. Few mourned her absence from the gatherings she had once dominated so completely, and fewer still extended her the sympathy she had shown so rarely to others throughout her years of quiet cruelty. On a bright autumn morning, 3 months after that first fateful evening at the Royal Opera House, Eleanor stood once more in that very building, though this time, she stood beside Julian, her hand resting in the crook of his arm, watching the same crowd that had once whispered about her refusal, now smile warmly in their direction. "Do you regret it?" Julian asked quietly, leaning close, "refusing me that first evening, before any of this began?" Eleanor considered the question, watching the candlelight flicker gold across the gathered crowd, remembering the fear and pride that had driven her that night, and the long, difficult road that had led them both to this quiet, joyful moment. "No," she said finally, smiling up at him. "That refusal was the first honest choice I made in 2 years of fear. I do not regret it. I only regret that it took a second glance, and everything that followed, for me to understand that not every powerful man hides cruelty behind his charm." Julian smiled, drawing her hand to his lips once more. "Then I am glad, more than I can say, that you gave me that second glance, Eleanor. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it was worth the risk." The orchestra began to play, the same aria that had filled the hall the night they first met, and this time, Eleanor listened without fear, standing beside the man she had once refused and now, at last, would marry, secure in the knowledge that love, when built on honesty rather than convenience, could withstand even the cruelest schemes designed to destroy it. The wedding took place on a bright morning in early spring, in the small stone church near Ashbourne's country estate, with only close family and dearest friends in attendance, exactly as Eleanor had wished, far removed from the crowds and whispers that had once defined every significant moment of her life. Her father walked her down the short aisle with tears openly shining in his eyes, his shoulders straight and proud, in a way Eleanor had not seen since long before the Cormorant's loss had nearly ruined them all. Her mother sat in the front pew, weeping happily into a handkerchief she had embroidered herself with tiny, careful stitches over the preceding weeks, unable to contain her joy at seeing her daughter's future secured not through desperate necessity, but through genuine, hard-won love. Julian waited at the altar, watching Eleanor approach with an expression of open wonder that made her chest ache with happiness. All trace of the careful, guarded composure he had worn the night they first met, entirely absent from his face. "You look as though you cannot quite believe this is happening," Eleanor whispered as she reached his side, unable to resist the small tease even in so solemn a moment. "I confess I still find it difficult to believe," Julian murmured back, his eyes never leaving hers. "A year ago, I resigned myself to a lifetime of convenient arrangements and polite distance. Now I stand here, marrying a woman who refused me the very first time we met, and I have never felt luckier in all my life." The ceremony passed in a warm haze of vows spoken plainly and sincerely, without the elaborate flourishes society might have expected of a duke's wedding, exactly as both Eleanor and Julian had wished. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathered crowd erupted into genuine joyful applause, and Eleanor found herself laughing through happy tears as Julian drew her close. The following months brought changes neither of them had fully anticipated. Eleanor settled into life at Ashbourne's country estate with a quiet determination to understand every aspect of the household and lands that would now, in part, fall under her care. She spent mornings walking the tenant farms with Julian, learning the names of families who had worked the land for generations, listening to their concerns with the same careful attention she had once given her own family's struggles. "You have a gift for this," Julian observed one afternoon, watching her converse easily with an elderly tenant farmer about a leaking roof that required urgent repair. "My mother, God rest her, never took the time to learn even the names of half our tenants. I know what it feels like to fear losing everything," Eleanor said simply. "I cannot forget that, now that our circumstances have changed so completely. It would feel like a betrayal of the woman I was 2 years ago, frightened and uncertain, wondering if we would keep our home through the winter." Julian's expression softened with quiet admiration. "That woman built the very foundation of the person you have become, Eleanor. I would not wish her forgotten either." Their days settled into a rhythm neither had experienced before, filled with purposeful work and genuine companionship, rather than the isolated performance of duty Julian had known for so many years before their meeting. He found himself, more often than not, seeking her counsel on matters of the estate that he might once have decided entirely alone, valuing the clear, practical wisdom she had gained through years of careful management during her family's hardship. Eleanor's parents visited often, her father's shipping business slowly rebuilding its reputation through steady, honest dealings, aided in no small part by the confidence Julian's continued fair partnership had restored to him. Her mother, delighted beyond measure at her daughter's happiness, took to spoiling the household staff with small kindnesses whenever she visited, until the servants at Ashbourne began looking forward to her arrivals nearly as much as Eleanor did herself. Charlotte married the following year, a quiet, kind gentleman she had met at Eleanor's own wedding celebration, and the two cousins remained as close as ever, exchanging letters filled with news and laughter that spanned the growing distance between their respective homes. That autumn, Eleanor and Julian hosted their own gathering at Ashbourne, a modest affair compared to the grand parties London society had once expected of a duke, filled instead with genuine friends and family rather than careful strategic alliances. Eleanor found herself, for the first time in her life, standing at the center of a room, not out of necessity or fear, but out of simple, easy belonging. "You have transformed this house," her mother observed, watching Eleanor move comfortably among the guests, offering warm greetings and easy laughter, without a trace of the careful caution that had once shadowed every social interaction. "It feels alive in a way I do not believe it has in years." "Julian says the same," Eleanor said, smiling, "though I think the house simply needed someone willing to open its doors properly, rather than guard them so carefully against the world." Winter brought quiet evenings by the fire, long conversations that stretched late into the night, and a growing ease between them that neither had anticipated when their courtship first began under such difficult circumstances. Julian taught Eleanor to ride properly through the snow-dusted grounds, laughing freely at her early stumbles in a way that would have seemed impossible to the guarded, careful man she had first refused at the opera. Eleanor, in turn, taught him patience with the estate's smaller tenant disputes, showing him how careful listening often resolved conflicts that sharp authority alone could never quite settle. By the following spring, whispers began to circulate through London that the Duchess of Ashbourne was expecting their first child, and Eleanor watched, with quiet amusement, as the very drawing rooms that had once dissected her refusal at the opera now buzzed instead with genuine well-wishes and warm anticipation for the growing family. Her mother wept happy tears for the second time in as many years, and her father, upon receiving the news, declared it the finest inheritance any grandfather could hope to receive, far greater than any fortune the sea had once threatened to take from them. Word occasionally reached them of Cassian's continued exile on the continent, living modestly on the remains of a fortune considerably diminished by his disgrace, and though Eleanor felt no particular satisfaction in his misfortune, she found she could finally think of him without the cold unease that had once accompanied any mention of his name. Lady Margaret, they learned, had retreated entirely to a small property in the countryside, her once formidable presence in London society reduced to occasional unkind letters that Julian read and set aside without response, unwilling to let old wounds disturb the peace he had finally found. Eleanor often thought, during those quiet, contented months, of the frightened young woman who had once stood in a crowded opera house and refused a duke's hand out of fear and pride, rather than any true understanding of who he was. She did not regret the woman she had been, guarded and cautious after years of hardship, but she marveled, quietly and often, at how far that same caution had ultimately carried her, toward a happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Nearly a year after their wedding, Eleanor and Julian returned to the Royal Opera House for the first time since that fateful evening when everything between them had begun. The same grand chandeliers blazed overhead, the same orchestra tuned their instruments in the pit below, and yet everything felt entirely different from the tense, uncertain evening Eleanor remembered so vividly. "Do you remember," Julian asked, settling beside her in their private box, "the exact moment I asked you to dance and you refused me in front of half of London?" "I remember every detail," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory that had once filled her with dread and now brought only warmth. "I remember thinking you the most infuriating man I had ever encountered, and being entirely certain I would never see you again beyond the occasional unavoidable social gathering." "And now?" Julian asked, taking her hand gently in his. "Now," Eleanor said, resting her head against his shoulder as the orchestra began to play, "I think that refusal was the single luckiest choice I ever made, though I could not possibly have known it at the time." Julian pressed a soft kiss to her temple, and together they watched the performance unfold below. Two people who had found, against every expectation society had placed upon them both, a love built not on convenience or necessity, but on honesty, patience, and the quiet courage to trust one another, even when trust seemed the most difficult choice of all. Outside the Opera House, London continued its endless churn of gossip and ambition, new scandals rising to replace the old, new whispered rumors filling the drawing rooms that had once dissected every detail of Eleanor's refusal. But within the warm glow of their private box, none of that mattered any longer. Eleanor Hartley, now Duchess of Ashbourne, sat beside the man she loved, secure in a happiness that had been hard-won, and was, for that very reason, cherished all the more deeply, a happiness that no scheme, no scandal, and no cruel design would ever again come close to unraveling. As the final notes of the aria rose through the grand hall, Julian turned to her once more, his eyes full of the same quiet wonder she had glimpsed on their wedding day. "I love you, Eleanor," he said simply, "more today than the day I married you, and I suspect I will say the same thing every year that follows, for as long as we both shall live." Eleanor smiled, her heart full in a way she had once believed impossible for a woman who had learned, through hard experience, to guard it so carefully. "I love you too, Julian," she said, "and I am endlessly grateful that one glance, so long ago, changed everything."